All right, so let's start with our big story that has come in from Pakistan, where according to a study, it's being said that Pakistan happens to be one of the most unsafe places for journalists. Now, according to this report by Freedom Network, journalists are facing increased attacks in the country. The most significant findings of the report is that journalists working for print media reportedly are twice as more likely to face legal action than their colleagues in the electronic media. The Sindh region was 3 times more riskier for journalists to operate in than any other province within Pakistan. The most journalists, which is almost about 1/3 of them, have been charged with offences under different penal codes, while 1/3 of the journalists have been charged for offences that are related to terrorism. Now, the most common allegation that has been levelled against the journalists is that they are acting against state institutions or have defamed the state institutions because of their criticism of how the government has behaved. Moreover, in the trial, in about 60% of the cases is never concluded, which leaves the journalists without an opportunity to prove their innocence in most of these cases. Now, according to the report, nearly about 10 out of the last 17 cases never reached a conclusion, and therefore most of the journalists concerned simply did not receive any justice at all. The research further concluded that during the year 2018 to 2019, the law was used more often to harass journalists in Pakistan. Now, 6 journalists reportedly have survived assassination bids and 3 were kidnapped last month. 7 others have faced threats ranging from arrest, harassment and also assault to even legal cases that have been slapped on them. Now, more than 140 journalists reportedly have been killed in Pakistan since the beginning of 2000. That is 14 journalists killed in the last 20 years. So how's the journalistic community responding to this? Well, they showed a lot of spine. They decided to take out a protest march in central Islamabad. They condemned the government for the increasing pressure that the government has been putting on media outlets in critiquing the government. The curbs on media include censorship, unfair dismissal of journalists for speaking out against the government. Journalists end up losing their jobs. The protesters marched in central Islamabad this week from the press club to the Parliament building, where they chanted slogans in support of the right of journalists and also critiqued the government for its excesses. Citing one-sided pro-government coverage by the state-run PTV, presenter and senior journalist Owais Tawheed also resigned. Tawheed said that credibility is actually eroding from the media in the absence of objective delivery of news, and it blatantly continues its one-sided pro-government coverage against all journalistic norms of impartiality. All this at the cost of democratic practices of free press that are guaranteed, he claims, under the Pakistani constitution. All right, now to give us a perspective in terms of what is playing out in Pakistan, we are joined by senior journalist Imtiaz Gul, who is joining us live from Islamabad. Mr. Gul, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this broadcast on WION. And let me begin by asking you this. What's happening in Pakistan? Why are the journalists out on the streets protesting against the government?
Well, let me first say that whatever Owais Tawheed has done, I think is... I also do a show on PTV. Nobody has ever told me not to invite this person or that person. All other primetime shows do invite opposition leaders. And recently the National Assembly, the Parliament, was informed that 60% of the guests that have appeared in the last few months on PTV were from the opposition parties. And nobody ever told me, trust me, not to invite this or that. And I think Owais may have his own reasons, but we should not basically bring that into this conversation that you are focusing on. Secondly, there are 2 sides to it. One side that has been narrated on this channel, protests, most of the protests in the last few months have been they related to the arrest of Mir Shakilur Rahman, who owns the GOTV, the news. That was, I think, unfair. The arrest, and there was not enough evidence, or whatever evidence was, this was not probably conclusive, and the trial and detention should have been much more transparent. There's no two opinion about that, but we should not conflate the interests of the media owners with the rights of the workers. In this country, there's a lot of gray area in which journalists operate. For instance, the newspapers don't pay the withholding tax. They do not pay the withholding tax into the government exchequer that they deduct from the salaries of the workers. The newspapers don't pay their district correspondents, most of them, and they are forced then to indulge in other practices.
Mr. Gul, I understand the point that you're making about the corporate interests which own many of these media organizations, but the fact of the matter remains that Pakistan in the Press Freedom Index ranks 145. Now, India ranks 142. The question that I'm asking you is much larger. Now, the journalists in Pakistan have shown a lot of spine. They've stood up against the government. They're out on the streets in central Islamabad. They chanted slogans against the government. They said that the government is exerting pressure on them, and it is only allowing the pro-government coverage to be aired on the channels in the country. Do you concur with that?
No, I do not. There may be some curtailment of news, but I think day and night everybody is speaking about the army, about the intelligence agencies, about the government, day in and day out. We really have to be very realistic. There are issues in countries like yours, like ours. Not everybody. I mean, I have tried a number of times to get speakers, interview partners from India for my show. Even people I know who have been friends for past 20 years, they are reluctant in coming on my show just because they think it's not the appropriate time. And the very fact that journalists are on the street, they can take out procession, that all these statistics and surveys can be conducted and they are published in the newspaper, themselves reflect the level of the freedom or the latitude that these guys have, the press has. Of course, there are problems, but now to generalize that as something like the press is under clampdown, I think is unfair. But
being on the 145th rank in terms of the Press Freedom Index in the world, there are many African nations and South American nations which indeed are ahead of both India and, of course, Pakistan. Now, I want to give you some statistics here. 6 journalists have survived an assassination bid and 3 were kidnapped in just the last month. That does not speak well for press freedom in Pakistan.
Well, it's also relative, Saleh. I mean, yes, there are problems, as I said. In the outside Islamabad, in a number of areas, people who are shopkeepers, they're also filing reports for the newspapers, and at times, they have their own personal problems, disputes, which then result in excessive action by the authorities, by the police, and there is a lot of corruption in the police. There's no denial of that. So there's a lot of conflation of journalism with businesses, business interests, and also of people's personal business interests.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Imtiaz Gul, for joining us from Islamabad and giving us this perspective. But it is so heartening to see the journalists in Pakistan standing up against the government. They've taken out a protest march and they say that, look, the government cannot be slapping cases on journalists only because the journalists are speaking out against the government and are critiquing it wherever it is going wrong.